Hello, alchemists. Welcome or welcome back. My name is Ava, aka Queen Midas Life Alchemist, and I'm here for week 13 of The Body Keeps the Score here on Weekend Book Club. This is by Bessel Van Der Kolk, MD. Again, we are on week 13. So if you are joining in for the first time right now, welcome. I'd love to have you here. However, because this is the 13th week, you're jumping in over halfway through the book. So I would advise you to go back to week 1 because there's so much great information in here. And, you know, we're moving through a book, so that might make more sense. Yeah, so you all, we're just going to hop right in it. My booking link for personal readings is in my description, and also my email if you would like to contact me for collaboration or for business inquiries. So yeah, that's it. Like, share, subscribe, comment if you feel moved to throughout this video, and I'm just going to go ahead and get started. We're picking up on page 234, 234. Keep seeing those numbers a lot. This is the section called The Miracle of Self-Discovery. Discovering yourself in language is always an epiphany, even if finding the words to describe your inner reality can be an agonizing process. This is why I found Helen Keller's account of how she was born into language so inspiring. When Helen was 19 months old and just starting to talk, a viral infection robbed her of her sight and hearing. Now deaf, blind, and mute, this lovely, lively child turned into an untamed, isolated creature. After 5 desperate years, her family invited a partially blind teacher, Anne Sullivan, to come from Boston to their home in rural Alabama as Helen's tutor. Anne began immediately to teach Helen the manual alphabet, spelling words into her hand letter by letter, but it took 10 weeks of trying to connect with this wild child before the breakthrough occurred. It came as Anne spelled the word water into one of Helen's hands while she held the other under the water pump. Helen later recalled that moment in The Story of My Life. Water, that word startled my soul, and it awoke, full of the spirit of the morning. Until that day, my mind had been like a darkened chamber, waiting for words to enter and light the lamp, which is thought. I learned a great many words that day. And that was a quote from Helen Keller. Learning the names of things enabled the child not only to create an inner representation of the invisible and inaudible physical reality around her, but also to find herself. 6 months later, she started to use the first person I. Helen's story reminds me of the abused, recalcitrant, uncommunicative kids we see in our residential treatment programs. Before she acquired language, she was bewildered and self-centered. Looking back, she called that creature phantom. And indeed, our kids come across as phantoms until they can discover who they are and feel safe enough to communicate what is going on with them. In a later book, The World I Live In, Keller again described her birth into selfhood. Before my teacher came to me, I did not know that I am. I lived in a world that was a no world. I had neither will nor intellect. I can remember all this, not because I knew that it was so, but because I have tactual memory. It enables me to remember that I never contracted my forehead in the act of thinking. Helen's tactual memories based only on touch, could not be shared, but language opened up the possibility of joining a community. At age 8, when Helen went with Anne to the Perkins Institution for the Blind in Boston, where Sullivan herself had trained, she became able to communicate with other children for the first time. Oh, what happiness, she wrote, to talk freely with other children, to feel at home in the great world. Helen's discovery of language with the help of Anne Sullivan captures the essence of a therapeutic relationship, finding words where words were absent before, and as a result, being able to share your deepest pain and deepest feelings with another human being. This is one of the most profound experiences we can have, and such resonance in which hitherto unspoken words can be discovered, uttered, and received, is fundamental to healing the isolation of trauma, especially if other people in our lives have ignored or silenced us. Communicating fully is the opposite of being traumatized. We're in a new section now, page 235. This is called Knowing Yourself or Telling Your Story, our dual awareness system. Anyone who enters talk therapy, however, almost immediately confronts the limitations of language. This was true of my own psychoanalysis. While I talk easily and can tell interesting tales, I quickly realize how difficult it is to feel my feelings deeply and simultaneously report them to someone else. When I got in touch with the most intimate, painful, or confusing moments of my life, I often found myself faced with a choice. I could either focus on reliving old scenes in my mind's eye and let myself feel what I had felt back then, or I could tell my analyst logically and coherently what had transpired. When I chose the latter, I would quickly lose touch with myself and start to focus on his opinion of what I was telling him. The slightest hint of doubt or judgment would shut me down, and I would shift my attention to regaining his approval. Since then, neuroscience research has shown that we possess two distinctive forms of self-awareness, one that keeps track of the self across time and one that registers the self in the present moment. The first, our autobiographical self, creates connections among experiences and assembles them into a coherent story. This system is rooted in language. Our narratives change with the telling as our perspective changes and as we incorporate new input. The other system, moment-to-moment self-awareness, is based primarily on physical sensations. But if we feel safe and are not rushed, we can find words to communicate that experience as well. These two ways of knowing are localized in different parts of the brain that are largely disconnected from each other. Only the system devoted to self-awareness, which is based in the medial prefrontal cortex, can change the emotional brain. In the groups I used to lead for veterans, I could sometimes see those two systems working side by side. The soldiers who told horrid tales of death and destruction, but I noticed that their bodies often simultaneously radiated a sense of pride and belonging. Similarly, many patients tell me about the happy families they grew up in while their bodies are slumped over and their voices sound anxious and uptight. One system creates a story for public consumption, and if we tell the story often enough, we are likely to start believing that it contains the whole truth. But the other system registers a different truth, how we experience the situation deep inside. It is this second system that needs to be accessed, befriended, and reconciled. Just recently at my teaching hospital, a group of psychiatric residents and I interviewed a young woman with temporal lobe epilepsy who was being evaluated following a suicide attempt. The residents asked her standard questions about her symptoms, the medication she was taking, how old she was when the diagnosis was made, what had made her try to kill herself. She responded in a flat, matter-of-fact voice. She had been 5 when she was diagnosed. She lost her job. She knew she'd been faking it. She felt worthless. For some reason, one of the residents asked whether she had been sexually abused. That question surprised me. She had given us no indication that she had had problems with intimacy or sexuality. And I wondered if the doctor was pursuing a private agenda. Yet, the story our patient told did not explain why she had fallen apart after losing her job. So I asked her what it had been like for that 5-year-old girl to be told that something was wrong with her brain. That forced her into checking in with herself, as she had no ready-made script for that question. In a subdued tone of voice, she told us what the worst part of the diagnosis was, that afterward her father wanted nothing to do with her. He just saw me as a defective child. Nobody had supported her, she said. So she basically had to manage by herself. I then asked her how she felt now about that little girl with newly diagnosed epilepsy who was left on her own. Instead of crying for her loneliness or being angry about the lack of support, she said fiercely, she was stupid, whiny, and dependent. She should have stepped up to the plate and sucked it up. That passion obviously came from the part of her that had valiantly tried to cope with her distress, and I acknowledged that it probably had helped her survive back then. I asked her how. I asked her to allow that frightened, abandoned girl to tell her what it had been like to be all alone, her illness compounded by family rejection. She started to sob and kept quiet for a long time until she finally said, "No, she did not deserve that. She should have been supported. Somebody should have looked after her." Then she shifted again and proudly told me about her accomplishments, how much she'd achieved despite the lack of support. Public story and inner experience finally met. This is the next section. The body is the bridge on page 237, if you're following along. Trauma stories lessen the isolation of trauma, and they provide an explanation for why people suffer the way they do. They allow doctors to make diagnoses so that they can address problems like insomnia, rage, nightmares, or numbing. Stories can also provide people with a target to blame. Excuse me. Blaming is a universal human trait that helps people feel good while feeling bad. Or, as my old teacher Elvin Simrod used to say, hate makes the world go round. But stories also obscure a more important issue, namely that trauma radically changes people, that in fact, they no longer are themselves. It is excruciatingly difficult to put that feeling of no longer being yourself into words. Language evolved primarily to share things out there, not to communicate our inner feelings, our interiority. Again, the language center of the brain is about as far removed from the center for experiencing oneself as is geographically possible. Most of us are better at describing someone else than we are at describing ourselves. As I once heard Harvard psychologist Jerome Kagan say, the task of describing most private experiences can be likened to reaching down to a deep well to pick up a small, fragile crystal figure while you are wearing thick leather mittens. We can get past the slipperiness of words by engaging the self-observing body-based self-system, which speaks through sensations, tone of voice, and body tensions. Being able to perceive visceral sensations is the very foundation of emotional awareness. If a patient tells me that he was 8 when his father deserted the family, I'm likely to stop and ask him to check in with himself. What happens inside when he tells me about that boy who never saw his father again? Where is it registered in his body? When you activate your gut feelings and listen to your heartbreak, when you follow the interoceptive pathways to your innermost recesses, things begin to change. Next section, page 238, called Writing to Yourself. There are other ways to access your inner world of feelings. One of the most effective is through writing. Most of us have poured out our hearts in angry, accusatory, plaintive, or sad letters after people have betrayed or abandoned us. Doing so almost always makes us feel better, even if we never send them. When you write to yourself, you don't have to worry about other people's judgment. You just listen to your own thoughts and let their flow take over. Later, when you reread what you wrote, you often discover surprising truths. As functioning members of society, we're supposed to be cool in our day-to-day interactions and subordinate our feelings to the task at hand. When we talk with someone with whom we don't feel completely safe, our social editor jumps in on full alert and our guard is up. Writing is different. If you ask your editor to leave you alone for a while, things will come out that you had no idea were there. You are free to go in a sort of a trance state in which your pen or keyboard seems to channel whatever bubbles up from inside. You can connect those self-observing and narrative parts of your brain without worrying about the reception you'll get. In the practice called free writing, you can use any object as your own personal Rorschach test for entering a stream of associations. Simply write the first thing that comes to your mind as you look at the object in front of you, and then keep going without stopping, rereading, or crossing out. A wooden spoon on the counter may trigger memories of making tomato sauce with your grandmother or being beaten as a child. The teapot that's been passed down for generations may take you meandering to the furthest reaches of your mind, to the loved ones you've lost or family holidays that were a mix of love and conflict. Soon an image will emerge, then a memory, then a paragraph to record it. Whatever shows up on the paper will be a manifestation of associations that are uniquely yours. My patients often bring in fragments of writing and drawings about memories that they may not yet be ready to discuss. Reading the content out loud would probably overwhelm them, but they want me to be aware of what they're wrestling with. I tell them how much I appreciate their courage in allowing themselves to explore hitherto hidden parts of themselves and in entrusting me with them. The tentative communications guide my treatment plan, for example, by helping me to decide whether to add somatic processing, neurofeedback, or EMDR to our current work. As far as I'm aware, the first systematic test of the power of language to relieve trauma was done in 1986 when James Pennebaker at the University of Texas in Austin turned his introductory psychology class into an experimental laboratory. Pennebaker started off with a healthy respect for the importance of inhibition, keeping things to yourself, which he viewed as the glue of civilization. But he also assumed that people pay a price for trying to suppress being aware of the elephant in the room. He began to ask each student to identify a deeply personal experience that they found very stressful or traumatic. He then divided the class into 3 groups. One would write about what was currently going on in their lives. The second would write about the details of the traumatic or stressful event. And the third would recount the facts of the experience, their feelings and emotions about it, and what impact they thought this event had had on their lives. All of the students wrote continuously for 15 minutes on 4 consecutive days while sitting alone in a small cubicle in the psychology building. The students took the study very seriously. Many revealed secrets that they had never told anyone. They often cried as they wrote, and many confided in the course assistants that they'd become preoccupied with these experiences. Of the 200 participants, 65 wrote about a childhood trauma. Although the death of a family member was the most frequent topic, 22% of the women and 10% of the men reported sexual trauma prior to the age of 17. The researchers asked the students about their health and were surprised how often the students spontaneously reported histories of major and minor health problems: cancer, high blood pressure, ulcers, flu, headaches, and earaches. Those who reported a traumatic sexual experience in childhood had been hospitalized on an average of 1.7 days in the previous year, almost twice the rate of the others. The team then compared the number of visits to the student health center participants had made during the month prior to the study to the number in the month following it. The group that had written about the facts and the emotions related to their trauma clearly benefited the most. They had a 50% drop in doctor visits compared to the other 2 groups. Writing about their deepest thoughts and feelings about traumas had improved their mood and resulted in a more optimistic attitude and better physical health. When the students themselves were asked to assess the study, they focused on how it had increased their self-understanding. It helped me think about what I felt during those times. I never realized how it affected me before. I had to think and resolve past experiences. One result of the experiment was peace of mind. To have to write about emotions and feelings helped me to understand how I felt and why. In a subsequent study, Pennebaker asked half of a group of 72 students to talk into a tape recorder about the most traumatic experience of their lives. The other half discussed their plans for the rest of the day. As they spoke, researchers monitored their physiological reactions: blood pressure, heart rate, muscle tension, and hand temperature. This study had similar results. Those who allowed themselves to feel their emotions showed significant physiological changes, both immediate and long-term. During their confessions, blood pressure, heart rate, and other autonomic functions increased, but afterward their arousal fell to levels below where they had been at the start of the study. The drop in blood pressure could still be measured 6 weeks after the experiment ended. It is now widely accepted that stressful experiences, whether divorce or final exams or loneliness, have a negative effect on immune function. But this was a highly controversial notion at the time of Pennebaker's study. Building on his protocols, a team of researchers at the Ohio State University College of Medicine compared two groups of students who wrote each other about a personal trauma or about a superficial topic. Again, those who wrote about personal traumas had fewer visits to the student health center, and their improved health correlated with improved immune function. As measured by the action of T lymphocytes, or natural killer cells, and other immune markers in the blood. This effect was most obvious directly after the experiment, but it could still be detected 6 weeks later. Written experiments from around the world with grade school students, nursing home residents, medical students, maximum security prisoners, arthritis sufferers, new mothers, and rape victims consistently show that writing about upsetting events improves physical and mental health. Another aspect of Pennebaker's studies caught my attention. When his students talked about intimate and difficult issues, they often changed their tone of voice and speaking style. The differences were so striking that Pennebaker wondered if he had mixed up his tapes. For example, one woman described her plans for the day in a childlike, high-pitched voice, but a few minutes later, when she described stealing $100 from an open cash register, both the volume and pitch of her voice became so much lower that she sounded like an entirely different person. Alterations in emotional states were also reflected in the subject's handwriting. As participants changed topics, they might move from cursive to block letters and back to cursive. There were also variations in the slant of the letters and the pressure of their pens. Such changes were called switching in clinical practice, and we see them often in individuals with trauma histories. Patients activate distinctly different emotional and physiological states as they move from one topic to another. Switching manifests not only as remarkably different vocal patterns, but also in different facial expressions and body movements. Some patients even appear to change their personal identity, from timid to forceful and aggressive, or from anxiously compliant to starkly seductive. When they write about their deepest fears, their handwriting often becomes more childlike and primitive. If patients who present in such dramatically different states are treated as fakes, or if they are told to stop showing their unpredictably annoying parts, they are likely to become mute. They probably will continue to seek help, but after they have been silenced, they will transmit their cries for help, not by talking, but by acting, with suicide attempts, depression, and rage attacks. As we will see in chapter 17, they will improve only if both patient and therapist appreciate the roles that these different states have played in their survival. So there's a couple examples here. Here's this one. You can see the handwriting switching. From the top, it's like smaller, more controlled looking, and then as it gets to the bottom, it's bigger, more childlike looking. And I'll actually read what it says. This is in the smaller handwriting. So many times I find parts of myself fighting each other. If the abuse happened, it didn't happen. If the abuse happened, it didn't happen. If it did happen, how can I live with the truth that is so horrific? And then underneath it says, with my left hand right here, and then it says, listen to me. I want to tell you, and I want you to listen. Do you think you're too good to hear it? I hear what? And then that's the end of that. And then here's another one, another example. You see it's like starting out more controlled, and then it gets bigger and like more spaced apart. And this one says, I want to hurt myself because I feel like I'm bad. My mother calls and leaves me sad messages, and I don't call her back. When I think about being little, I remember never wanting her to find me, and I feel like she's looking for me now. She knows things about me that no one else knows. So that's the part that gets bigger, is she knows things about me that no one else knows. I felt the energy in that one just reading it. Okay, so that is the end of this section for this, the end of this section, and we're moving on to the next section on page 242 called Art, Music, and Dance. Okay. There are thousands of art, music, and dance therapists who do beautiful work with abused children, soldiers suffering from PTSD, incest victims, refugees, and torture survivors, and numerous accounts attest to the effectiveness of expressive therapies. However, at this point, we know very little about how they work or about the specific aspects of traumatic stress they address, and it would present an enormous logistical and financial challenge to do the research necessary to establish their value scientifically. The capacity of art, music, and dance to circumvent the speechlessness that comes with terror may be one reason they are used as trauma treatments in cultures around the world. One of the few systematic studies to compare nonverbal artistic expression with writing was done by James Pennebaker and Anne Krantz, a San Francisco dance and movement therapist. 1/3 of a group of 64 students was asked to disclose a personal traumatic experience through expressive body movements for at least 10 minutes a day for 3 consecutive days, and then to write about it for another 10 minutes. A second group danced but did not write about their trauma, and a third group engaged in a routine exercise program. Over the 3 following months, members of all groups reported that they felt happier and healthier. However, only the expressive movement group that also wrote showed objective evidence, better physical health, and an improved grade point average. The study did not evaluate specific PTSD symptoms. Pennebaker and Krantz concluded, the mere expression of the trauma is not sufficient. Health does appear to require translating experiences into language. However, we still do not know whether this conclusion that language is essential to healing is in fact always true. Writing studies that have focused on PTSD symptoms as opposed to general health have been disappointing. When I discussed this with Pennebaker, he cautioned me that most writing studies of PTSD patients have been done in group settings where patients were expected to share their stories. He reiterated the point I made above, that the object of writing is to write to yourself, to let yourself know what you have been trying to avoid. Okay. We are on to the next section. I really don't know why I just took that deep of a breath. I think because I'm like processing and like having like personal stuff go through my head as I'm reading this, and then thinking about things in my life that have helped me to process trauma. And I'm like having these almost flashbacks or like memories coming in as I'm reading this. So if I like stumble in certain parts, it's because like I'm having stuff resurface. Okay, next section, page 243, called The Limits of Language. Trauma overwhelms listeners as well as speakers. In The Great War in Modern Memory, his masterful study of World War I, Paul Fussell comments brilliantly on the zone of silence that trauma creates. And this is the quote or the excerpt. One of the cruxes of war is the collision between events and the language available or thought appropriate to describe them. Logically, there is no reason why the English language could not perfectly well render the actuality of warfare. It is rich in terms like blood, terror, agony, madness, shit, cruelty, murder, sellout, pain, and hoax, as well as phrases like legs blown off, intestines gushing out over his hands, screaming all night, bleeding to death from the rectum, and the like. The problem was less one of language than of gentility and optimism. The real reason that soldiers fall silent is that soldiers have discovered that no one is very interested in the bad news they have to report. What listener wants to be torn and shaken when he doesn't have to be? We have made unspeakable mean indescribable. It really means nasty. That's the end of the excerpt. Okay. Talking about painful events doesn't necessarily establish community, often quite the contrary. Families and organizations may reject members who air the dirty laundry. Friends and family can lose patience with people who get stuck in their grief and hurt. This is one reason why trauma victims often withdraw and why their stories become rote narratives, edited into a form least likely to provoke rejection. It is an enormous challenge to find safe places to express the pain of trauma, which is why survivor groups like Alcoholics Anonymous, Adult Children of Alcoholics, Narcotics Anonymous, and other support groups can be so critical. Finding a responsive community in which to tell your truth makes recovery possible. That is also why survivors need professional therapists who are trained to listen to the agonizing details of their lives. I recall the first time a veteran told me about killing a child in Vietnam. I had a vivid flashback to when I was about 7 years old, and my father told me that a child next door had been beaten to death by Nazi soldiers in front of our house for showing a lack of respect. My reaction to the veteran's confession was too much to bear, and I had to end the session. That is why therapists need to have done their own intensive therapy so they can take care of themselves and remain emotionally available to their patients, even when their patients' stories arouse feelings of rage or revulsion. A different problem arises when trauma victims themselves become literally speechless, when the language area of the brain shuts down. I have seen this shut down in the courtroom in many immigration cases, and also in a case brought against a perpetrator of mass slaughter in Rwanda. When asked to testify about their experiences, victims often become so overwhelmed that they are barely able to speak or are hijacked into such panic that they can't clearly articulate what happened to them. Their testimony is often dismissed as being too chaotic, confused, and fragmented to be credible. Others try to recount their history in a way that keeps them from being triggered. This can come across as evasive and unreliable witnesses. I have seen dozens of legal cases dismissed because asylum seekers were unable to give coherent accounts of their reasons for fleeing. I've also known numerous veterans whose claims were denied by the Veteran Administration because they could not tell precisely what had happened to them. Confusion and mutism are routine in therapy offices. We fully expect that our patients will become overwhelmed if we keep pressing them for the details of their story. For that reason, we've learned to pendulate our approach to trauma, to use a term coined by my friend Peter Levine. We don't avoid confronting the details, but we teach our patients how to safely dip one toe in the water and then take it out again, thus approaching the truth gradually. We start by establishing inner islands of safety within the body. This means helping patients identify parts of the body, postures, or movements where they can ground themselves, whether they feel stuck, terrified, or enraged. These parts usually lie outside the reach of the vagus nerve, which carries the messages of panic to the chest, abdomen, and throat, and they can serve as allies in integrating the trauma. I might ask a patient if her hands feel okay, and if she says yes, I'll ask her to move them, exploring their lightness and warmth and flexibility. Later, if I see her chest tighten and her breath almost disappear, I can stop her and ask to focus on her hands and move them so that she can feel herself as separate from the trauma. Or I might ask her to focus on her breath and notice how she can change it, or ask her to lift her arms up and down with each breath, a Qigong movement. For some patients, tapping acupressure points is a good anchor. I ask others to feel the weight of their body in the chair or to plant their feet on the floor. I might ask a patient who is collapsing into silence to see what happens when he sits up straight. Some patients discover their own islands of safety. They begin to get that they can create body sensations to counterbalance feelings of control. This sets the stage for trauma resolution, pendulating between states of exploration and safety, between language and body, between remembering the past and feeling alive in the present. New section, page 245, called Dealing with Reality. Dealing with traumatic memories is, however, just the beginning of treatment. Numerous studies have found that people with PTSD have more general problems with focused attention and with learning new information. Alexander McFarlane did a simple test. He asked a group of people to name as many words beginning with the letter B as they could in 1 minute. Normal subjects average 15 words. Those with PTSD average 3 or 4. Normal subjects hesitated when they saw threatening words like blood, wound, or rape. McFarlane's PTSD subjects reacted just as hesitantly to ordinary words like wool, ice cream, and bicycle. After a while, most people with PTSD don't spend a great deal of time or effort on dealing with the past. Their problem is simply making it through the day. Even traumatized patients who are making real contributions in teaching, business, medicine, or the arts, who are successfully raising their children, expend a lot more energy on the everyday tasks of living than do ordinary mortals. Yet another pitfall of language is the illusion that our thinking can easily be corrected if it doesn't make sense. The cognitive part of cognitive behavioral therapy focuses on changing such dysfunctional thinking. This is a top-down approach to change in which the therapist challenges or reframes negative cognitions, as in, let's compare your feelings that you are to blame for your rape with the actual facts of the matter. Or let's compare your terror of driving with the statistics about road safety today. I'm reminded of the distraught woman who once came into our clinic asking for help with her 2-month-old because the baby was so selfish. Would she have benefited from a fact sheet on child development or an explanation of the concept of altruism? Such information would be unlikely to help her until she gained access to the frightened, abandoned parts of herself, the parts expressed by her terror of dependence. There is no question traumatized people have irrational thoughts. I was to blame for being so sexy. The other guys weren't afraid. They're real men. I should have known better than to walk down that street. It's best to treat those thoughts as cognitive flashbacks. You don't argue with them anymore than you would argue with someone who keeps having visual flashbacks of a terrible accident. They are residues of traumatic incidents, thoughts they were thinking when or shortly after the traumas occurred that were reactivated under stressful conditions. A better way to treat them is with EMDR, the subject of the following chapter. New section, page 246, called Becoming Somebody. The reason people become overwhelmed by telling their stories and the reason they have cognitive flashbacks is that their brains have changed. As Freud and Brewer observed, trauma does not simply act as a releasing agent for symptoms. Rather, the physical trauma, or more precisely, the memory of the trauma, acts like a foreign body, which long after its entry must continue to be regarded as an agent that is still at work. Like a splinter that causes an infection, it is the body's response to the foreign object that becomes the problem more than the object itself. Modern neuroscience solidly supports Freud's notion that many of our conscious thoughts are complex rationalizations for the flood of instincts, reflexes, motives, and deep-seated memories that emanate from the unconscious. As we have seen, trauma interferes with the proper functioning of brain areas that manage and interpret experience. A robust sense of self, one that allows a person to state confidently, this is what I think and feel, and this is what is going on with me, depends on a healthy and dynamic interplay among these areas. Almost every brain imaging study of trauma patients finds abnormal activation of the insula. This part of the brain integrates and interprets the input from the internal organs, including our muscles, joints, and balanced proprioceptive system, to generate the sense of being embodied. The insula can transmit signals to the amygdala that trigger fight-flight responses. This does not require any cognitive input or any conscious recognition that something has gone awry. You just feel on edge and unable to focus, or at worst, have a sense of imminent doom. These powerful feelings are generated deep inside the brain and cannot be eliminated by reason or understanding. Being constantly assaulted by, but consciously cut off from, the origin of bodily sensations produces alexithymia, not being able to sense and communicate what is going on with you. Only by getting in touch with your body, by connecting viscerally with yourself, can you regain a sense of who you are, your priorities and values. Alexithymia, dissociation, and shutdown all involve the brain structures that enable us to focus, know what we feel, and take action to protect ourselves. When these essential structures are subjected to inescapable shock, the result may be confusion and agitation, or it may be emotional detachment, often accompanied by out-of-body experiences. The feeling you're watching yourself from far away. In other words, trauma makes people feel like either somebody else or like nobody. In order to overcome trauma, you need help to get back in touch with your body, with yourself. There is no question that language is essential. Our sense of self depends on being able to organize our memories into a coherent whole. This requires well-functioning connections between the conscious brain and the self system of the body. Connections that often are damaged by trauma. The full story can be told only after those structures are repaired and after the groundwork has been laid, after nobody becomes somebody. Awesome. We are on chapter 15, and this is our last page turn for today. If you have not liked the video and you like what I'm reading, please like the video. Okay, starting chapter 15, page 248, called Letting Go of the Past, EMDR. Starting out with a quote from John Keats, "Was it a vision or a waking dream? Fled is that music. Do I wake or sleep?" David, a middle-aged contractor, came to see me because his violent rage attacks were making his home a living hell. During our first session, he told me a story about something that had happened to him the summer he was 23. He was working as a lifeguard, and one afternoon, a group of kids were roughhousing in the pool and drinking beer. David told them alcohol was not allowed. In response, the boys attacked him, and one of them took out his left eye with a broken beer bottle. 30 years later, he still had nightmares and flashbacks about the stabbing. He was merciless in his criticisms of his own teenage son and often yelled at him for the slightest infraction, and he simply could not bring himself to show any affection toward his wife. At some level, he felt that the tragic loss of his eye gave him permission to abuse other people, but he also hated the angry, vengeful person he had become. He had noticed that his efforts to manage his rage made him chronically tense, and he wondered if his fear of losing control had made love and friendship impossible. During his second visit, I introduced a procedure called eye movement desensitization and reprocessing, or EMDR. I asked David to go back to the details of his assault and bring to mind his images of the attack, the sounds he had heard, and the thoughts that had gone through his mind. Just let those moments come back, I told him. I then asked him to follow my index finger as I moved it slowly back and forth about 12 inches from his right eye. Within seconds, a cascade of rage and terror came to the surface, accompanied by vivid sensations of pain, blood running down his cheek, and the realization that he couldn't see. As he reported these sensations, I made an occasional encouraging sound and kept moving my finger back and forth. Every few minutes, I stopped and asked him to take a deep breath. Then I asked him to pay attention to what was now on his mind, which was a fight he had had in school. I told him to notice that and to stay with that memory. Other memories emerged, seemingly at random, looking for his assailants everywhere, wanting to hurt them. Getting into barroom brawls. Every time he reported a new memory or sensation, I urged him to notice what was coming to mind and resumed the finger movements. At the end of that visit, he looked calmer and visibly relieved. He told me that the memory of the stabbing had lost its intensity. It was now something unpleasant that had happened a long time ago. It really sucked, he said thoughtfully, and it kept me off kilter for years, but I'm surprised that a good life I eventually I'm surprised what a good life I eventually was able to carve out for myself. Our third session the following week dealt with the aftermath of the trauma, how he had used drugs and alcohol for years to cope with his rage. As we repeated the EMDR sequences, still more memories arose. David remembered talking to a prison guard he knew about having his incarcerated assailant killed and then changing his mind. Recalling his decision was profoundly liberating. He had come to see himself as a monster who was barely in control, but realizing that he turned away from revenge put him back in touch with a mindful, generous side of his self. Next, he spontaneously realized he was treating his son the way he had felt towards his teenage attackers. As our session ended, he asked if I could meet with him and his family so he could tell his son what had happened and ask for forgiveness. At our fifth and final session, he reported that he was sleeping better and said that for the first time in his life, he felt a sense of inner peace. A year later, he called to report not only that he and his wife had grown closer and had started to practice yoga together, but also that he laughed more and took real pleasure in his gardening and woodworking. Last section for today, this is page 250, and it's called Learning About EMDR. My experience with David is one of many I have had over the past 2 decades in which EMDR helped to make painful recreations of the trauma a thing of the past. My introduction to this method came through Maggie, a spunky young psychologist who ran a halfway house for sexually abused girls. Maggie got into one confrontation after another, clashing with nearly everybody, except the 13 and 14-year-old girls she cared for. She did drugs, had dangerous and often violent boyfriends, had frequent altercations with her bosses, and moved from place to place because she could not tolerate her roommates, nor they her. I never understood how she had mobilized enough stability and concentration to earn a PhD in psychology from a reputable graduate school. Maggie had been referred to a therapy group I was running for women with similar problems. During her second meeting, she told us that her father had raped her twice, once when she was 5 years old and once when she was 7. She was convinced it had been her fault. She loved her daddy, she explained, and she must have been so seductive that he could not control himself. Listening to her, I thought, she might not blame her father, but she sure is blaming just about everyone else, including her previous therapist for not helping her get better. Like many trauma survivors, she told one story with words and another in her actions, in which she kept replaying various aspects of her trauma. Then one day, Maggie came to the group eager to discuss a remarkable experience she'd had the previous weekend at an EMDR training for professionals. At that time, I'd heard only that EMDR was a new fad in which therapists wiggled their fingers in front of patients' eyes. To me and my academic colleagues, it sounded like yet another of the crazes that have always plagued psychiatry, and I was convinced that this would turn out to be another of Maggie's misadventures. Maggie told us that during her EMDR session, she had vividly remembered her father's rape when she was 7, remembered it from inside her child's body. She could feel physically how small she was. She could feel her father's huge body on top of her and could smell the alcohol on his breath. And yet she told us, even as she relived the incident, she was able to observe it from the point of view of her 29-year-old self. She burst into tears. I was such a little girl. How could a huge man do this to a little girl? She cried for a while and then said, "It's over now. I know what happened. It wasn't my fault. I was a little girl and there was nothing I could do to keep him from molesting me." I was astounded. I had been looking for a long time for a way to help people revisit their traumatic past without becoming re-traumatized. It seemed that Maggie had had an experience as lifelike as a flashback and yet had not been hijacked by it. Could EMDR make it safe for people to access the imprints of trauma? Could it then transform them into memories of events that had happened far in the past? Maggie had a few more EMDR sessions and remained in our group long enough for us to see how she changed. She was much less angry, but she kept that sardonic sense of humor that I enjoyed so much. A few months later, she got involved in with a very different kind of man than she'd ever been attracted to before. She left the group announcing that she'd resolved her trauma, and I decided it was time for me to get trained in EMDR. That is the end for today, you all. So I've heard about EMDR before, and actually I went to a farmer's market in Dallas with my friend last summer, and that's how I first heard about this book. And she actually was first telling me about, I'm not sure which way it worked, but she was telling me about EMDR and how she had gone through it and was kind of explaining it. And then the topic of this book came up. Then it came up a couple other times earlier this year, and I felt really called to get this book and read it to people. And so it's really cool that the EMDR topic is coming up now, and I'm having a better understanding of what it is. And if any of you have had that therapy, please comment below how it's helped you, or if you know anything else about it that hasn't been mentioned, or your thoughts on it. Yeah, let's just get a conversation going. All right, you all, that is it for today. I will be back next week for week 14. We're getting closer to the end of this. It's been a few months now. And yeah, thank you again for being here with me. Thank you all for all your donations, your likes, your comments, your subscribes, your dropping in on my lives. Everything, all your support and energetic return. I really, really appreciate it. And I would not be here without you all. I would not have this channel without you all. Yeah, you're my tribe. So have a great day. And remember that you are sovereign, powerful, worthy, and loved. I love you all, and I'll see you next time. Bye.